Example 7, we're finding the exact value of tangent of those two things being added together, right? So, before we actually start working on these pieces, we're adding two things together, aren't we? So that's like a U and a V, isn't it? So before we start working them out separately, do we have the formula for tangent of U plus V? All right.
Make it like A and B, because my U's and V's keep looking
You can make it what you need it to be, okay? All right, so I'm just going to write out my tangent formula first, and then we'll go back in and plug it. Well, we don't have to. I'll read it to us. All right, so tangent of U plus V. This is going to be a fraction. And on top, we have tangent of U, but our U is that inverse sign, isn't it? Plus tangent of V. V is that inverse cosine. All over 1 minus tangent of U times tangent of V. Now, after you write all this out, I would go back through and look and make sure you didn't make any mistakes as far as just writing it, because that's a lot of parentheses and everything, and I don't want you getting confused. Okay, so now let's go through and let's talk about the pieces there. Let's talk about that inverse sign. And so we know that that's when we're looking for an angle, and we put theta. We could have put U if it would help. And we know then if we take the inverse, it becomes the original, and that's going to make these two switch places. All right, so we know the inverse sine of theta is equal to theta, so we could have said this is now tangent of, let me actually do this. Let's switch it to U. So we don't get confused when we look back at our work. So can I find tangent of U if I know sine of U? Yes. How? Well, using identities, remember, we know that tangent of an angle is equal to sine of that angle over cosine of that angle, isn't it? So if I know cosine, then I can plug this in and solve, couldn't I? How can I find cosine?
From sine.
Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. We know sine is negative 4/5. Oh wait, didn't we just do this in the previous problem? Well, no, not quite. It was similar though.
It was 3/5.
Yeah, it was 3/5. And we ended up with a 4/5, didn't we? All right, so I'm running out of room, so we're going to subtract that 16 over 25 over. And so we get cosine squared of U is equal to, is that 9 over 25? Take the square root. And so cosine of U is plus or minus 3/5. Now, we didn't talk about the quadrant we're in, though, did we? So we were talking about inverse sine. And what do we know about inverse sine? What quadrants can it be in? quadrant 4 and quadrant 1, okay? But if sine is negative, which of those two quadrants is it really in? So this one was in quadrant 4. So what do we know about cosine then in quadrant 4? It's positive. So
why did we need cosine u again?
why did I do what?
Why did we need to find that?
Because tangent is sine over cosine. And so I'm going to take this, I'm going to come back up here now. We know sine is negative 4/5, and we know cosine is 3/5. So what is tangent? Negative 4 over 3. So we know tangent of u is negative 4/3. So I'm going to leave myself some room to work here. So I'm just going to, well, continue it on here. So this tangent of u right here is negative 4/3. I'm going to plug in something there. And be careful though, because it's on bottom as well, right? Here's also that tangent of that inverse sine. So that's also tangent of u. Now we need to go find tangent of the inverse cosine of negative 12 over 13. Well, let's take that inverse cosine, negative 12 over 13, and we know it's going to equal an angle, but we're going to put angle V because that's what it's in the place of. And so that means that cosine of V is equal to negative 12 over 13. And so this here's a V, so really we're looking for tangent of V, aren't we? So we're going to do the same thing, but with these numbers, and find what our tangent is. And so remember, we know that tangent is equal to sine over cosine. We already know cosine of V. I could go ahead and put that in if you want to. We got to go find sine of V, don't we? So sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. We're looking for sine. Cosine is negative 12 over 13.
This one we already did.
Yeah, this one, well, I think though it was it cosine? I think so. Yeah, it was, but it was a positive, it's the only difference, but that's okay. So you've got something to look back on right there above, right? So I squared it. Subtract the fraction there. So sine squared equals 25 over 169. And take the square root. So sine of V is equal to plus or minus 5 over 13. But we got to figure out what quadrant we're in. Inverse cosine is in what two quadrants? It's the one that's different. It's in 1 and 2. Technically, on these guys, even on the one we just did with the inverse sine, quadrants 1 and 2, sine's going to be the same value. But just for grins and giggles, what quadrant are we actually in if cosine is a negative 12 over 13? It's quadrant 1 or quadrant 2? 2. And so what do we know about sine in quadrant 2? It's positive. And so we're going to take that and we're going to plug it in up there for our sine value. So we divide them out and we get negative 5/12. So that's going to take the place of that tangent of V right here. which is the same exact thing as right there. And then we just have to work it out. Okay, so let's plug the numerator into our calculator. Unless you want to do it without it, which you're welcome to.
How do you do it without it?
You have to find a common denominator, which you could just multiply by the other one's denominator, add the numerators over the common denominator, and then reduce.
Really just overlooking everything I just wrote down, trying to understand.
All right, so what do we get for the numerator? Okay, I changed it to a fraction, but
7, 4.
right, same thing. I just went with I think I actually did this without my calculator. All right, what do we get for the denominator?
4, 1.
And then when I divide them,
I got 63 over 4.
I got negative 63 over,
16.
I got 16.